Welcome to a next episode on catalyzing radical systemic change, where I'm aiming to map and weave the ties closer to what I think are the necessary steps and ingredients for a planetary civilization ahead. Today's topic is rather a broad one, so it's about leadership. So I'm sitting here in the virtual room together with Michael Stern from Emerging Leaders Project. And like always in my podcasts, I don't leave the person outside. So I'm really curious to listen into be it your childhood, your adolescence, or your adulthood. What were the defining moments that made you who you are and ultimately obviously also tie you, together with that broad topic of leadership? Curious to listen in, Michael.
Okay, thank you, Alistair. It's nice to be here with you, and thank you for the invitation. So I guess one thing that comes up from like the early part of my life is my parents were divorced when I was around 2 or 3, and I was always going back and forth between their places. And later in life, I liked traveling a lot. That was a very big influence on my journey. And when I was doing these big trips, I noticed people would often respond sort of saying things like, wow, you're so brave, or I could never do that, or, don't you miss being home, or things like this. And that sort of helped me realize one thing about myself, which is that I do feel pretty comfortable going place to place, being in different environments and different social circles. I've never felt very deeply tied down to like one particular place. And I think there's, some pros and cons with that, but that has definitely been a thread, both physically, geographically, and also socially. I like engaging with different communities and being that sort of bumblebee butterfly kind of character. So that is a theme that I think has been relevant. And I would say normally I sort of trace my journey back to being in high school, being around 15 or 16. And I went to a very conventional, elite high school in New York City, very competitive. And it wasn't a great like culture fit for me. So I was smart enough to get by, but I wasn't thriving, and I was struggling emotionally and just feeling like I was going through the motions, walking this path that other people had laid out for me, but didn't really believe in, and felt, sort of disillusioned and disenfranchised with where that was supposed to be taking me. So my first mentor was a teacher I had for a class called The History of Religion. And in that class, it was basically like a comparative religions kind of survey class. So we would read some excerpts from sacred texts from all kinds of different traditions. And he would never give us tests in the normal sense of that word, in terms of, memorizing names and dates and having to answer multiple choice questions and things like that. His exams were always more like journaling prompts, and he would ask us to have an actual personal reflection on these kind of core themes and nuggets of wisdom that we were exploring from these different traditions. And he had a couple of ideas that just really stuck with me. They just really spoke to me at that time. For example, one was that he would often criticize our school for being so focused on an education of the mind and failing to do more of like a whole person, whole being type of education. I didn't exactly know what he meant by that. You know, I was pretty young, but just intuitively, I could feel the truth and the resonance of what he was saying. Another idea was he had this term he used called baby religion. And the idea there was viewing religions in general through the lens of right and wrong, good and bad, mine is better, yours is worse, we're the chosen people, you're the, you know, devil worshippers, like all this kind of stuff. And he had this term that he would contrast that with, which was basically, it was like, actually, you could maybe tell me, I think this was a made up German word called Religionswissenschaften, is how I remember it. And the way he described it was like, you have to really experience these different traditions for themselves and take what's true for you to learn more about your own experience and the shared human experience. And they all have something beautiful and profound to teach us. So yeah, those kinds of lessons and those kinds of perspectives at that time meant a lot to me and really stuck with me. And then he was also the person who took me on my first trip to Europe, to Italy and France, and gave me my first taste of like being immersed in another culture. And that showed up for me a lot in both college, where I studied abroad in Madrid, and then I moved back to Spain after. And then later when I moved to Thailand and spent some time there, and also Nepal, and lived there and was studying Tibetan Buddhism pretty intensively. So that short time of a year or two in high school planted some seeds that really continued to bear a lot of fruit in my life. And I actually just hung out with him a couple of weeks ago to have lunch at his house and catch up. And it was really sweet because, yeah, he's one of those people where looking back, you know, he just totally changed my life. And I can't imagine where I would be if I hadn't had that relationship with him.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? I had a similar encounter. Actually, the guy from whom I'm wearing the mala, his name was Williges Jäger, and he was a Benedictine monk, but at the same, like a Zen teacher in both the Rinzai and the Soto tradition, where my father was wise enough to put me in front of that creature, you know, when I was 16 ish.
Yeah.
And this had repercussion effects throughout my whole life. What I'm curious now, we're still pretty early in your biography. When was the first time the terminology, or even without the terminology, but just this like wrestling with this broad, you know, topic of leadership came about?
Yeah. So, okay, I'll get there. I have to put a few pieces in place first. So I mentioned I lived in Nepal for about 10 months, and I was studying Tibetan Buddhism. And that experience was the first time I felt like I had discovered answers. I had gone through high school and college and a few years after college with a sense of struggling, trying to figure things out. Where's the meaning? What am I really doing? What is this all for? You know, like really the kind of existential angst and looking around me and not feeling like anybody had anything useful to tell me about it. That changed when I was in Nepal and was really experientially and more profoundly introduced to the Buddhist teachings. However, it was at the end of my time there when a friend of mine suggested I check out the work of Ken Wilber. And I started reading his work, and I started listening to podcasts with Andrew Cohen and Craig Hamilton and Terry Patton and, you know, all of those kind of thought leaders and spiritual teachers. Something really clicked into place for me. This evolutionary perspective, this developmental understanding, the sense that we were living at a time of profound social and cultural transformation, and that there was a kind of trajectory that we could zoom out far enough to be able to see. That all just totally blew my mind and lit me up. So when I got back to New York, I just really dove into that community and spent a few years just immersed in different communities of practice. And I was organizing and hosting events. So I was inviting these same kinds of thought leaders. I had personal relationships with several of them. So really an amazing time of learning and meeting incredible people and doing a lot of just deep personal work. But I was still working in restaurants, which was like my previous career in hospitality. And the longer that went on, the more I started to feel this kind of split, this fragmentation. And I couldn't really see myself staying in hospitality long term. I really wanted to figure out a way to align my career with this other deeper work that I was doing. So through that, I was really interested in education and business as sort of like social leverage points where I felt like the systems we have are really messed up, and they have the potential to have the really greatest impact on human beings and society. So if we could just make some changes there, that would be, really valuable. So this was right around the time that things like conscious capitalism and social entrepreneurship and impact investing and also co-working were all sort of becoming more popular. People were starting to talk about that more. So I got really interested in that pathway as an area where there was this kind of convergence of values and purpose and personal development with business and leadership and organizational development. So I found my way to a co-working space in New York City called Center for Social Innovation. And that was an amazing place full of a really diverse group of big nonprofits, small nonprofits, for-profits, entrepreneurs, freelancers, like really all kinds of different people, but everybody had a social mission as part of their work. That was kind of the glue that held it all together. So I volunteered there for a while and then found a job working for a small consulting company that was doing sort of holistic leadership development training programs. They used a kind of a holistic model of body, mind, heart, spirit, like that. And the founder of the company was also a practicing Tibetan Buddhist meditator. And, we used language about resilience and peak performance and building capacity and emotional intelligence and purpose and things like that. So that was a really, really exciting opportunity for me to try to bring all of this stuff that I had been learning in the personal and spiritual development world into the business and leadership world. And so that was really kind of where I got my start doing that kind of work.
I wonder, when you look at the, let's say, market for leadership, in our preparation for the podcast, I was sketching you that I see many or most of the products being tailored to rather, let's say, C-suite type of people, often charging quite a hefty ticket. I wonder then, from all your learning and your experiences, what pulled you into your own project? Was there a defining moment? Was there a difficulty wrestling with the circumstances? So I'm trying to come to an understanding with almost what's the birthing of Emerging Leaders Project.
Right. Yeah. So while I was at Center for Social Innovation, I met my would-be co-founder, whose name is Chelsea. And we met several years before we ended up working together, but it was through that community that we met. And so what happened was, for me, at some point I decided it was time to leave the consulting company that I mentioned, and that's when I started my own private coaching practice. And the clients that I was working with most often were basically people like myself, people in their late 20s, early 30s, who were struggling with a sense of meaning and purpose and trying to figure out a life path that felt authentic to them and would still allow them to make a decent living and, this kind of thing. So after a while of working with enough people and working on these same kinds of questions, I just had the realization, like, this is not just a few random outlier cases and something is wrong with these people. This is actually an edge in cultural development. And the way I came to think of it was at the big, like as a sort of analogy, was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, things like safe working conditions and viable minimum wages were not a given. People had to organize and advocate for themselves to establish that as fundamental rights for workers. And I basically see something similar happening over the last few years, but at the next level, which is like, we want to do work that's personally meaningful. We want to have a work-life balance that is sustainable. We want our companies to, have a sense of mission and values and be sort of ecologically minded and things like that. So the whole social cause and social well-being issue has started to surface in the younger generations, I think in particular, as not just a nice to have, but a must have, And so then I got really interested in, so one thing, let me just back up for a second. When I was involved in the integral spirituality practice world, what I was really most interested in was we-space practices. So I was involved in a bunch of different groups doing different versions of that. So I was very interested in collective intelligence and collective wisdom and things like this. So, and group process. So once I had worked with enough coaching clients individually that this pattern became clear to me, I then got interested in what would happen if I started to convene groups around these questions. And as a way to move towards that, I outlined a kind of a curriculum using the framework that I learned from Ken Wilber, Wake Up, Grow Up, Clean Up, Show Up. And I was calling that concept integral development for emerging leaders. And the idea was, what are the skills and practices that somebody who is in the early stages of their career journey would need to take on for themselves in order to become the kind of person that they would need to be to have the impact on the world that they want to have, right? So really viewing the outer impact. This was something that showed up for me really clearly at that co-working space, and was also the seed connection point between me and Chelsea. We saw that in this community at the co-working space, people were so passionate and committed to the social impact piece, but there was a little bit less of an understanding about how our interior and spiritual development.
Yeah, let's cut that. I don't know who was breaking up, but let's just recap the last minute, because my observation is exactly the same, so that people in the social circles put so much emphasis on the, let's say, output and the systems change, that they often tend to overlook actually the beauty, the magic, the simplicity, and the elegance of an integral practice framework. Just start again.
Yeah. So one of the things I really noticed about being in that co-working space was that people were so passionate and committed to the systems change component, but they tended to have less of an understanding or a prioritization of their own interior development and how where they were coming from as human beings would influence and drive their ability to create positive change in the outer world. So that was my orientation when I started to put together this course, really having more of a focus on those inner skills and inner practices so that the people, so that the participants would then, from a human development perspective, be able to show up in the world as the kinds of social impact leaders that they aspire to be. So I took that idea down. By this time, I was already living in Maine. I had moved from New York City, and I took my idea back down to Center for Social Innovation. I invited some clients, some colleagues, and some friends, and I pitched this concept to them just to get some early feedback. And Chelsea was one of the people I shared it with and spoke to about it. And she had been working, by this time, she was working for the co-working space. And she was thinking that she was approaching the end of her time there and was starting to think about what would come next for her. And so we both had noticed this same observation, but we both had our own individual path that we had been following very committedly for several years. Those paths looked very different, but we shared this similar conviction in how important our personal development work was in the social impact space. And so that was really the hook where we felt like, okay, we've got something here that we want to keep exploring together. And what we did was just start to invite friends and friends of friends to do what I would call like experiential inquiries, where we would just facilitate these kinds of explorations of themes around this intersection between our personal work and systems change. And in particular, we were framing that conversation in terms of what we eventually would call the Great Transition, which is this time that we're living in, the context of, like you used the phrase, a planetary civilization, and this was before COVID, but we were already obviously aware of climate change and technological acceleration and social challenges, political challenges, right? So we were already seeing that we were heading towards some kind of tipping point. And it was that situation, that context, that made it so important, so urgent for us to have this conversation about personal transformation and systems transformation. So that was really the birth of Emerging Leaders Project.
Let's try to slice this very, like, let's say, deep intro into multiple chunks, or disentangle the complexity for the listeners to be able to follow more succinctly. Is in the mission statement I read, Emerging Leaders Project exists to empower current and future leaders to work skillfully with emergence, steward humanity through the great transition, and co-create a more beautiful world. Could you elaborate on that? I'm specifically asking because it's a bold undertaking. It's also pretty generic. So let's start with, what are you actually doing? I think the why piece, right? The people already get a sense of it, right? And the how piece, but more like, what are you actually doing with these cohorts of people?
Great. So, yeah, so I mentioned we've been working together since 2018, and we've gone through a few iterations, and we're constantly evolving and pivoting and testing, things like that. So the first phase was really oriented around these in-person gatherings. And to me, the phrase community of practice really captures something about the essence of what we are. we are a group of people who share this commitment and this kind of set of values, who come together to practice. What do we practice? We practice our own personal transformation work. We practice relational work and the we space and the intersubjective practices, which I think we'll get more into. And we also share about the outer work that we're doing, and sometimes get feedback, do some coaching kinds of experiences, things like that. So it's really that intersection of the I, the we, and the it, where our practice focuses. So phase one was in-person gatherings. Phase two was we then did pivot to doing more corporate work, training, coaching, consulting with bigger companies, leaders, teams, leadership development pipelines, things like that. Then COVID hit, and that changed the game. So we moved to doing online gatherings, similar to what we had been doing in person in New York, but now we were really emphasizing the global aspect. And, in the beginning, it was a lot about sort of how people were processing the pandemic. But we continued to host bi-weekly Zoom calls ever since then. So we're coming up on 2.5 years now. And that's really kind of the heartbeat of the community. And what we do there ranges from very open conversational time to just connect with each other and check in and see how we're doing and be nourished by the social field, to much more highly facilitated and structured kinds of experiences where Chelsea and I might guide people through a personal reflection journey and some breakout sessions and some harvesting and, really like a workshop kind of experience. To guest presentations from people in our network that we feel are doing interesting, relevant work, and we want to introduce that to our community. So it's different every time, but it always has some of those same underlying themes. And then out of that core heartbeat rhythm of the bi-weekly calls, we've also done a number of what we would call either courses or labs, which would take a particular theme, like let's say we did one on storytelling, we did one on systemic constellations, we did one where we created a mentorship environment for some of our younger community members in Gen Z. So things like that, where we would pull out a particular theme that was alive in the community and create a more contained space to go deeper into that together. We did one with the case clinic process from Otto Scharmer's Presencing Institute, which I think is a wonderful tool. So yeah, concretely, that's kind of what it looks like right now. And what we're moving towards is what we're calling an academy, which would be like a platform where we could offer online courses from different creators, different providers, content creators. And the theme there would again be sort of essential tools and skills for current and future leaders to, as the mission statement says, skillfully work with emergence and steward humanity through the great transition. So that's our big goal, the bold aspiration.
Let's play the devil's advocate. So when I think, because we're both familiar with the same frameworks, so when I think about my own leadership, like let's say self-leadership, right? That would be practices like definitely my gym practice, how I eat, how I sleep, definitely my meditation training, visualization, training my mind, but also my spirit aspects of myself. What I'm curious and would love the listeners or the people that watch the video, but most of the people will listen to it on one of the podcasting platforms, is what are intersubjective practices? And if you could highlight some, maybe you could directly prototype them with me, so what happens? So imagine somebody gets interested and says, I never heard anything about intersubjective practices, or I heard a little bit about it, but I never did train, so to say, that faculty, that line of development. What would that look like? So first, maybe a couple of examples, and then maybe we could live test that.
That sounds great. I love that. Yeah, so as we mentioned, I think in our pre-chat, it's a kind of new emerging field. Different people have different understandings and interpretations and approaches, so I'll just share my own take on it. And maybe I'll start by saying what got me interested initially was being in these group workshop experiences that I mentioned when I was kind of really diving into the whole integral scene. And these moments that would occur every now and then, where one person might be the person who was speaking or sort of the focus of the group's attention. But as that person was going through their process, you could feel, I could feel, and generally we could all feel, something moving through the group. So even though on one level it was a particular person's experience, on another level we were all having a shared experience. And whether that was a kind of healing movement where something felt like it was being released or held in a way that it had never been held or seen before, or whether it was a more like creative, excited, you know, kind of innovative download kind of experience, these collective moments of coherence always felt like the richest parts of those workshops to me. And I just got really curious about what is going on there. How does that happen? Does anybody know how to do that? Not just so it happens, you know, randomly, but that we can actually go there intentionally together, things like that. So that was what initially drew my attention. And I think, you know, there's different sort of like how we might think of an individual developing through their own stages of consciousness, let's say. I think there are also stages of we space that we can experience. A common one would be something like being at a sports game where there is a shared emotional journey, you know, where all at the same time, we're all feeling elated and ecstatic and exuberant. And then 10 minutes later, we're all feeling crushed and disappointed and we can't believe it. And being in the collective is a big part of that experience, right? We're not only there to watch the game, we're there to be in the crowd and have that shared experience. So we're always in some type of intersubjective field whenever we're in relationship with other people. But I think what gets really interesting is when we start to put our attention on what that experience is like and how it is that the way we're showing up actually influences that experience, whether it's the words that we're saying or the way that we're saying them or our body language or the eye contact or the environment that we're in or whatever. All of these things are playing a part in that shared experience. And when we turn our attention to what that experience is like, it's sort of like in a personal meditation experience, you know, you bring your awareness to your experience and suddenly you start to notice all these things about your experience that were always there. You just never noticed them because you weren't paying attention. And as you start to pay more attention, that experience begins to unfold in a very different way. And you start to notice more and more subtle things, and you can start to really work with that experience much more intentionally. So I think it's very similar in an intersubjective practice where we all sort of tune in to like the space between us is a kind of typical phrase, you know, or the dynamics between us, the energy between us and around us. And then we can start to give language to that. We can start to express what that experience is like. And as we begin to articulate that, it does something to the field and it changes what the experience is like. And then we can all go on this collective journey together where we deepen into that shared space. And at some point, what becomes possible is that we can actually sort of center our awareness in the shared space, and something starts to come through the group's field that isn't actually coming through any one person in particular. So this idea that the sum is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, right? Something like that. So every time we come together with a group of people, something is possible that wasn't actually possible before because I was not with that group of people. So how can we tune in to what that possibility might be and then align ourselves to help that possibility actually come into form? And I think that's where it gets really interesting in terms of the systemic change piece, because I see these kind of intersubjective practices as being really foundational for creating spaces of coherence where these higher possibilities can start to come through us. And then our role is to kind of be the vehicle that can then manifest, take action on behalf of those higher possibilities and create, more regenerative systems that reflect those higher potentials.
So let's get wild here and dive deep into the rabbit hole. So the first time that I met Andrew Cohen and Tom Steininger and Elizabeth Diebold was back in 1999. So I've been experiencing quite some of these fields, and I also built up the integral scene, so to say, during my studies for almost 7 years in my 20s, which now again almost 15 years back. And I think I'm still wondering if I think there's two components inside of myself where I'm saying, are we overly mystifying the we space? And there's also the sense that when people are coming together, that up to a certain level can let go of their ego, persona, story, what they want to have out of the space, a transactional logic, then truly, in as much as I myself as Alistair can become a conduit for something greater than myself to flow through me, and me just being the vessel or the conduit or the instrument for it, then obviously this phenomenon can also happen in the we space. My gut feeling though, and I think the gross misunderstanding or my critique on the we spaces so far that I've been seeing facilitated, is we can't leave the interpersonal out of the intersubjective. So we need to clean the personal relationships. So I saw many circles facilitated that were trying to almost build the coherence in the group field, but before that have not dealt with the tensions on an interpersonal level, which then kind of almost sugarcoats the experience. So this obviously was not so much a question, but more myself wrestling with this, I mean, basically the core of our conversation. So there's something to it. So far, nobody that I'm aware of can really reproduce that like properly, right? Unless, and this would be then a question maybe more directly into your direction, unless you know the people, you're working in like longer periods of time, and they really have a base layer of knowing how to, let's say, clean up their own mess before they meet in the space together. So just curious to really yeah, dive deeper into that together.
Yeah, thanks for that. I am aligned with that perspective, that critique. First, I think it's helpful to think of it the way you were describing, that there's a kind of personal coherence and there are practices that support that. And the more I can show up in a group space, both coherent, but also with the tools to bring myself back to coherence when something triggers me, or whatever happens, right, which is inevitable sometimes, that is a critical starting point. And then once we are in that group setting, I don't know that it necessarily takes time. There's some interesting nuances here that I would be happy to spend time on with you and unpack further. But I think like the key thing is like trust and safety and a sense of intimacy and relatedness. And sometimes if you have a group of people who come together under the right conditions and they're solid practitioners in themselves and the facilitation is good and things like that, sometimes you don't need much time to enter into that space of coherence. And if you're in that space of coherence, I think you can go quite quickly to a deeper intersubjective experience together. However, I think that doesn't negate what you're saying, which is that you do need that sense of coherence on the relational level in order to go there. And if there are interpersonal tensions or places where there's dissonance or whatever, and you try to step over those or go around them to get to some quote unquote deeper place, I think you run into challenges for sure. And so I think that is actually one of the key skills of either a group or a facilitator who's interested in this, is to sort of be able to gauge where on the journey the group is and tailor the practices, the techniques that are being used, the structures, the prompts, the principles, all of that, the agreements, to establish coherence at that stage, wherever the group is. And then through that coherence, the next stage kind of unfolds on its own. And that was one of the things I experienced in those early group workshops, was that nobody was saying, hey, we're going to do this intersubjective thing right now. It just came from a space of coherence and intimacy and vulnerability and relatedness. And so that showed me that it was kind of like a natural unfolding that could occur. You don't have to try to make that happen. But I think what does often happen, as you said, is that we try to go there first and we miss some of that more foundational work that is actually what enables it to happen in the first place.
So since you put so much emphasis on these intersubjective practices, why do you think they are so crucial for us in the times we're in?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to your phrase, the planetary civilization. In my view, the opportunity, the sort of evolutionary leap that we're on the threshold of, is to cohere as a planetary intelligence that can operate with a level of coherence that was not possible before, as far as I know, because we have a globalized society and a technological infrastructure that allows us to communicate instantly across space and time. That's amazing. And I think that as we have to be careful with the we's. certain cultural lineages have sort of lost the connection to Earth and the understanding that we're interconnected and interdependent with all life. And that realization is, beginning to, we're remembering that. And so I think when you combine that understanding with the technology to potentially really operate as a unit, that's amazing. The same way that, atoms operate as a molecule and molecules operate as a cell and so on up the biological chain of being. I think the possibility for a planetary intelligence that both honors the diversity of not just humanity, but life, and also honors the unity of life. That to me is like the really exciting possibility that intersubjective practice begins to make possible, because it gives us the tools and the practices and the techniques to enter into those spaces of shared coherence, even when there are differences present in the space. So long term, that's kind of where I see it going. In the midterm, I think it has amazing implications for leadership and organizations and government, where if you could start to have pockets of people who are making decisions on behalf of much larger groups of people, really enter into a deep practice of coherence and inviting this kind of higher wisdom to come through, and allowing that higher wisdom and that sense of emotional intimacy and really being in touch with, connected to the system that they're influencing, and then making decisions and taking actions from that place, I think you would see some pretty interesting things start to happen. So that's the part of our purpose statement that says empowering current and future leaders to work skillfully with emergence. It's really that kind of a process where we're first orienting towards a kind of group coherence and a kind of sacred listening that then informs the strategy and the project planning and the task management and all that kind of stuff.
So again, interesting that we're sharing. It's not often that I do a podcast with somebody that seems to share, let's say, so many commonalities in terms of like framework, but also like lived experiences from integral and own contemplative practice. Let's look at the market. I mean, from boutique consulting to collective leadership offerings, a lot of things are moving in the market, and a lot of them are proclaiming, to synthesize ancient wisdom, maybe even indigenous wisdom, collective healing, and social innovation. Where do you see, especially now after 2.5 years of intense prototyping, where do you see your unique fragrance in all of that?
Mm-hmm. Cool. I love that question. Okay, I'll start with the I, the individual component. I'm interested in what I call like trans-lineage spirituality. So this goes back to that story I told about my teacher, Pasquale De Vito, and this idea that the religious traditions are kind of like facets of a jewel, and the jewel is wisdom, the non-dual wisdom love that's at the essence of reality, something like that. And I think we're at a point now where we can both we have the possibility to both update religious traditions in a way that preserves the mystical core, the essence of the teachings in the way that it is unique to each tradition, but also to be part of this shared human lineage that we're all in. And I think science is part of that, whether it's neuroscience and understanding how different spiritual practices affect our brains and our bodies, or whether it's something like quantum physics and having a different perspective on the unified field and energetic resonance and things like that. So I'm excited about this kind of translineage, global, human, spiritual path that might be opening up. And yeah, that makes some really interesting things possible in terms of, you know, the group of people who identify as sort of spiritual but not religious, or, you know, other, that there can be some kind of common framework, and some evidence-based approaches that still honors the raw, like, mystical mystery at the same time. That feels interesting to me, just from like a personal perspective.
And I mean, we can't predict the future, right? We're all co-creating it together. But if you were to extrapolate your expertise, your knowledge, your network, and were to look into the crystal ball, what do you think are the crucial levers towards manifesting that, you know, planetary civilization ahead? We all know our hearts is possible in peace, ecological health, abundance with all sentient beings on this beautiful planet called Earth.
The first thing that comes up for me, and I think this also is relevant to your last question too, in terms of the collective, you know, because as you said, we're operating with this I, we, it framework, and so are many other people, and that's wonderful. I think one thing that I hold more and more strongly all the time is recentering the sacred, in terms of communities and in terms of systems, that we aim to create ways of life and institutions that support those ways of life that center the sacred. And I think whether we're talking about the possibility for communities to engage in collective healing work with, you know, collective trauma, intergenerational trauma, or whether we're talking about social innovation, design, you know, more creative kind of systems building work, I think the foundation really needs to be that connection with and honoring of the sacred at the center. So if we can do that, I think that would then have tremendous ripple effects through all the leverage points. But like I said earlier, I'm particularly interested in education, because I view education as something that we're all always experiencing. You know, education is from the moment you're born to the moment you die, and maybe beyond. Not just the time that you're in school until you're 18 or whatever, you know. So I think if we could reframe our understanding around education and create some infrastructure to support that, that would be amazing. And then I also think business and economics is a big one, because I think the current dominant form of our economic model is just so destructive to life and the ecosphere. And yeah, it just really disconnects us further and further from the things that are most important. So I would love to see some big transformations happening in that space as well.
For those who are listening and now having more questions than answers, can you give a couple of pointers to people where they can make maybe an experience of an intersubjective practice, or tools or resources? Or do you have more a broader pointer, where people standing in a life phase or towards their own self-leadership? Yeah, so I'm curious if you can give a couple of pointers for the audience.
Sure. Well, one thing I'll mention, since it's coming up, is this came through for me when we were down in Austin at the Emerge gathering. And it became really clear to me how my sense of that space is I would really love to contribute this emphasis on intersubjective practice as kind of my role within that broader movement. So I'm feeling called to try to organize something, some kind of gathering where exploring intersubjective practice would be really the central theme. So there's nothing concrete I can point people to just yet, but I'll share the intention so that it's out in the world, and I'll keep you posted, Alistair, if things start to come through on that. But I would say that Ria Beck's work, Collective Presencing, is a really excellent intersubjective practice that I've been getting a lot of value from recently. The folks you mentioned, Elizabeth and Tom Steiniger, Elizabeth Will, Tom Steiniger, what's their organization called again? Is it Emergent Dialogue? Is that what their practice is?
Yes.
Yeah, Emergent Dialogue. I haven't done it myself, but I've heard really good things. A lot of my friends have done it. And I sort of know a bit about their lineage and their history. So I definitely consider that a resource. I find Thomas Hubel's work, he's got more of a focus on collective healing, collective trauma these days, but that is very much rooted in a sort of deeper mystical understanding. And going back to the critique you mentioned about sometimes overstepping the interpersonal and the relational piece, I find his work to be just absolutely incredible on that level as well. So those are definitely some great resources for that. And I also really love Dan Goleman's work on emotional intelligence, because I find it to be one of the best, if not the best, example we have so far of this synthesis between evidence-based approaches, where there's a lot of great research that's already been done and that continues to be done in the lab, evidence as well around the impact on leaders and personal performance, like how these practices allow you to be a more effective change maker. And there's also a deeper component to his work that is just it's dharma, it's transformation. It's not just about being a better leader or being a better performer at your job. It's about really becoming a more wise and compassionate version of yourself, and that I think is really beautiful. So I love his work as well.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for your contribution.
Thank you.